Hello again. A government needs to ensure decisions made don't leave the youth with a bleak future. That's the view of climate activist Otsile Nkadimeng. He was one of the panelists representing the youth at the Presidential Climate Commission Colloquium on electricity recommendations. Nkadimeng says government needs to ensure decisions made do not leave the youth with a bleak future. He's been raising concerns around the terms of the funding for the Global South's decarbonization efforts as it transitions from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Nkadimeng says the youth are not confident South Africa's electricity producer, Eskom, will be able to fulfill the country's energy ambitions. Well, for more, climate change activist Otsile Nkadimeng joins us now this afternoon today. Otsile, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you very much for your time. What's top of your concerns as a young South African when you look at the current efforts to implement the just energy transition?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I think I'd start off by saying that top of the concerns that I have is that we're not going to make it. Currently, we have failed to meet the commitments and the deadlines that we'd set for ourselves under agreements we've made under multiple international bodies. During the Paris Climate Conference, the Paris Climate Conference, we saw government make commitments to decarbonize. And then COP26 happened in Glasgow, and we were given this financing, $8.5 billion to help us initiate this just transition. Yet it seems that there's been a mismatch between what was spoken about on international levels and on the international stage on how South Africa is going to aspire to transition and what we're actually seeing on the ground.
Yeah, and how do you foresee, or how would you want to see young people like yourselves being included in the decision-making processes and, of course, the implementation?
Well, obviously, at the forefront of dealing with climate change will be bringing young people into the fold. It makes no sense that we'll be taking strategic decisions for the next 60, 70, upwards to a century on what South Africa is going to look like, yet the youth aren't involved. So we'd like to see more young people being put in positions in the Presidential Climate Commission, being put in key positions within the DMRE, within the Ministry of Electricity, so that we can ensure, one, that we actually do have voices of young people in positions of authority at such platforms that can fairly represent what young people want. And secondly, we want more young policymakers to be brought into the actual writing of these documents. When you look at the age group that is predominantly driving and is spearheading this shift, this just transition, you look at the senior management of Eskom, you even look at cabinet ministers, you look at director generals, you're not seeing youth representation there. And it goes back to an old saying, you can't expect adults who are already settled in their thinking to be taking strategic, somewhat changes for society and for young people, because frankly, they have too much to lose and they're not going to go that far. They're not going to push the needle as far as it needs to be pushed.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the older generation, we are on our way out. The future it belongs to you. Are you getting any evidence that your appeal for bringing on board at all these different levels you've discussed, bringing young people on board, is falling on fertile ears? I mean, are you seeing some action where you are being called to participate, not just you yourself, but young people in general?
Well, there were recommendations and there were lots of engagements that we had with the Presidential Climate Commission going into the colloquium and going into the final drafting that was going to be happening. And during that, we highlighted a lot of points that young people in the space are keen to get involved, but are there necessarily specific indicators, that is specific measures in the recommendations, not just for the Just Energy Transition Plan, investment plan, but also in plans going forward on how the just transition is going to be implemented. But what we saw was that our calls were being noted, but they weren't necessarily being translated into what was being discussed the next time we'd have the consultations. We'd find that the next time we have the consultations, we'll have to be reiterating the same points. But this is not just exclusive to the PCC. This is exclusive to engagements we have. The Department of Environment has had multiple engagements with youth stretching back as far as, I'd say, 2019. That was the first one I attended. And the most recent one was in 2021. Many of the points that young people keep raising on our concerns that the just transition is not being implemented, on concerns that the state is not prioritizing an energy transition which will best serve South Africa's economy and our crippling energy system. We felt that these concerns that we're raising and the points and the proposals that we bring forward, we find ourselves having to constantly regurgitate it. And again, another old saying, politics is the art of repetition. So we aren't going to lose stamina. We will keep repeating many of these points if we have to, but the reality is that we're running out of time, and more sooner rather than later, we will come to a point where we have to push the needle ourselves and not be requesting changes.
I mean, the effects of climate change are with us every day, and they affect the poorest of the poor the worst, but generally, they are there, and we in the media need to do more in terms of putting the climate change agenda very, very strongly, regularly as we can on the table, because it's affecting all of us. You said you won't stop, you've got the stamina, but are there other forms of putting pressure, like protests, for example, that have crossed your mind, Otsile?
Yes, well, protests are a component of it. So we as young people recognize that we need to approach this from multiple areas. So the PCC dialogues is from a policy standpoint, because we recognize that not only can we be out on the streets where the tire meets the tar, we need to be also in the rooms where we have some capacity to put forth our ideas in a policy setting and with the policy makers themselves. So the first component is we have the policy space, which is where we engage with the PCC and other stakeholders. Then we have the protests. I am a part of multiple organizations, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, which was founded by Greta Thunberg, and the Sundial Movement, which I co-founded, which is a high school's climate action network. So we mobilize specifically high school learners to take action on climate change. Now, the protest component that we identify is that we need young people to be the ones driving this discussion. So currently we see that the dialogue around climate change is dominated by a lot of older youth who are now becoming, your older adults, your middle age. They're starting to enter their 40s. Some are going to be bridging into their 45s. Younger youth now more than ever are needed in this space, because we are going to push the needle as far as it can be pushed. And so with the Sundial Movement, what we strive to do is that we want to help young people, school-going students like myself, to be able to put the climate struggle in a language and in a term and in terms that is understandable to themselves, to their peers, to their family, and to their community, essentially making young people not only the ones driving the discussions, but the ones educating their communities and educating the people closest to them about the climate crisis. And so the protest component happens there. On September 21st, Sundial had our first school strikes. This was to prove that young people, school-going youth, can do this, that we are capable of challenging the systems that exist that aren't addressing climate change, that we can mobilize our voices. With Fridays for Future, obviously, national body that it is, we are going to be mobilizing a massive strike with as many stakeholders and as many young people as possible.
Yeah, and that was last September, and I might have missed it, the coverage, or we might not have covered it. Final question to you as a young climate change activist, Otsile. What would you like to see the role of us in media be in this space?
We need to talk about it more. We mention it, but we mention it as if we are talking about something that is mundane. The urgency needs to translate to people who are seeing the effects of climate change first, and we need to take the conversation to them. So the role of media going forward will be that media needs to, you need to bring us, the young people, you need to bring us, the people who are seeing the effects of climate change firsthand, to your platforms. We need to speak about this, and we need to help people understand the urgency around it. So we need to essentially dilute or work the climate message into something that is digestible to people. So one, they understand what climate change is and how it's going to impact them, but they really, really get a fair and a stronger understanding of what is at stake should be felt, because the majority of people who I've come across don't really understand the devastation that is going to happen should we fail to address climate change, how it's going to impact their bread and butter.
You don't have to look far.
Discussions.
You don't have to look far for the devastation. Just the other week, we saw the impact of the longest-lasting cyclone, Freddy, that it lashed Madagascar twice, Mozambique twice, and up to Malawi. And, of course, our own KwaZulu-Natal got hit last April, a year ago, by those devastating floods. Otsile, I'm sure I'm going to be talking to you again in the near future. Thank you very much for your time. He's a climate change activist, giving us a young person's view about how we can tackle climate change. The main nub of his concern is that young people younger than 35 are not being included in discussions around the future. And it's only the older generation who are on their way out anyway, and they won't be around in future when the climate change effects impact our planet. Very valid point indeed. And we in the media need to do more in terms of coverage of climate change as a very topical issue.